our official newspapers on September 18, 2013, and a copy of said notice was posted at the borough's website and at the municipal compound.
Thank you, Rachel. Everyone, please stand for the pledge of allegiance.
To the flag of the United States of America, to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Ms. Sheridan? Here. Mr. Campbell? Here. Mr. Linus?
Yes, here.
Mr. McGovern?
Yes.
Mr. Kay?
Good.
Mr. Hoffman?
Here.
Mr. Meyer?
Here.
And Mr. Barry?
Here.
Okay, as everyone knows, this is a special meeting of the planning board for a review of the boardwalk redevelopment plan. Therefore, we'll forego any of the things we do with our normal meeting, such as the reading of the minutes or the memorialization of resolutions. Dave, turn it over to you.
Let me just start. We have some general notes that I began to, for purpose of the record, that we have a redevelopment plan. This is the boardwalk, referred to as the boardwalk redevelopment plan, which we marked as an exhibit at day one. We also have some general notes. What we're doing this evening is to review the redevelopment plan that has been proposed by mayor and council. It's been drafted and prepared in the offices of David G. Roberts. And our role this evening is in accordance with NJSA 48:12A-7. In a nutshell, what we're doing, there are certain requirements the plan should meet. Ultimately, our role is to take direction, release some information concerning whether or not the plan meets those goals. And then our role is, prior to the adoption, a formal adoption of the redevelopment plan, which is happening in this instance, mayor and council transmit the plan to us, and then we have a 45-day period within which to review the plan. The report that we prepare for the mayor and council should identify any of the provisions in the proposed redevelopment plan which are inconsistent with the master plan, and recommendations concerning those inconsistencies, and any other matters the board deems appropriate. The governing body then, once it receives that report, and considering the adoption of the redevelopment plan with revision or amendment to the plan, reviews the report of the planning board and may approve or disapprove any of the changes or any recommendations. If they decide, if we were to identify this evening something that is inconsistent with the master plan or the redevelopment ordinances, it does not result as a veto to mayor and council. Basically, mayor and council then have as a heightened vote requirement. Though we are the guardians of the master plan, so to speak, to make sure it's complied with, ultimately, like any other piece of legislation, this is what the master plan is, that's governed by mayor and council. Accordingly, if mayor and council decide not to abide by our recommendations, all it really does is it heightens the vote requirement. The vote requirement then of mayor and council to adopt that redevelopment plan is by a majority of the full authorized membership. In other words, it's not as simple as it's got a near minimum quorum of mayor and council. It couldn't pass by that vote. You need a majority of the full membership. If we fail to report back to mayor and council within the 45-day period, if it leaves mayor and council of any further obligation, they will go over second reading and move the redevelopment plan if they want to. This evening, our presentation, we'll swear Mr. Roberts in. And I think we can, well, I'll leave that to you folks as well, not want to accept the qualifications. You can certainly spread them on the record. Let me do this first. Let's raise your right hand. You swear or affirm the testimony you give before the board this evening is the truth, the whole truth?
Yes, I do.
Okay.
And we'll accept Mr. Roberts' qualifications. He's appeared before this board many, many times.
Okay. As I say, we've marked A1, which is the proposed redevelopment plan. Maybe just to spread on the record, again, this is by way of background, and I just asked Mr. Roberts to confirm my recollection that mayor and council proposed a resolution, number 2013-12, back in January 16 of 2013, basically assigned the planning board this role to review the redevelopment plan. Is that correct, sir?
That's to study the area to determine whether it would be meet the statutory requirements for a redevelopment.
Okay. And then by April 3rd or 23rd, actually the mayor and council specifically designated an area. And in this instance, the proposed redevelopment plan covers, and we'll have you testify to this as to the specific area, but a large portion of the boardwalk area along the ocean front and the roadway there. And this, in this instance, it's not going to act as sort of an overlay to the existing zoning, which is the public use overlay, but it will actually supersede the zoning there. Is that correct?
That's the way the plan is designed.
Well then, can you tell us a little bit about the area, what your role in helping design the redevelopment plan was?
Sure. Chairman, I guess I'll use this mic just in case it helps the record. Is it on? Good evening.
It's for the recording.
Okay, good. Mr. Chairman, Dave Roberts from Major Consulting, and as Mr. Kovacs had kind of summarized, this really began back in March when we conducted a study that the mayor and council had authorized the planning board to do of the boardwalk area based on the impact of Hurricane Sandy on the entire beachfront, which, as everyone knows, totally destroyed the boardwalk and all of the structures that were on the boardwalk. The report that the board considered back in March, when it made its recommendation to mayor and council that the area met the statutory requirement for an area in need of redevelopment, was based on criteria F, if you recall, which has to do with an area of 5 acres or more, which by reason of fire, flood, natural disaster, was resulted in a material loss of value. If you recall, we discussed the fact that the entire boardwalk area, which is really just one block and lot, block 3, lot 3, which consists of that stretch of the boardwalk that almost runs the entire length, but effectively runs from the southerly border of the borough almost up to about 2 blocks from the northerly end, but included all of the pavilions, the 5th Avenue, 10th Avenue, 13th Avenue, 8th Avenue pavilions. Were all part of that block 3 area, all of which was destroyed. And you recall that we made reference to the fact that the total assessed value for a number of years had been of roughly $54,400,000 for both land and improvements. And the improvements, which consisted of the boardwalk and all of the pavilions and all of the other structures on top of the boardwalk, were valued at about $3.4 million. They were all totally destroyed. And you also recall that in the appendix of that report were the engineer's reports recommending the demolition of all pavilions based on the fact that they were no longer structurally sound because of the impacts of the storm. And obviously no one remembers as painfully what that boardwalk and that beachfront looked like as the folks in this room. And we felt that, and still believe that constituted the criteria of the statute and the criteria for designation as an area of development. And we also recall that not only block 3, lot 3, but the right-of-way of Ocean Avenue was included in the overall area that's delineated. Based on the statute, local redevelopment and housing law, the next step in the redevelopment process would be the preparation of a redevelopment plan. Without a redevelopment plan, which is reviewed by a planning board very similarly to a zoning ordinance. When the mayor and council propose a zoning amendment, they would refer to you for a comment. In 35 days instead of 45 days, but the process is basically the same. And the reason for that is a redevelopment plan, because it is a combination of a master plan and a zoning ordinance for that particular area, is only adopted by ordinance. And it's treated basically as essentially as a companion to your zoning ordinance. In fact, the statute, as Mr. Kovacs explained, requires that the redevelopment plan, one of the mandatory components of it is that it states its relationship to the zoning ordinance. And in this case, in order to keep the redevelopment plan as simple as possible, the draft that you have before you this evening proposes that it supersede the zoning.
Effectively, what it does is incorporate the zoning that you have in your the zoning district along the boardwalk, but it's a little bit more specific. And I would say that, again, there's no proposed changes to any of the uses that the boardwalk had ever been used for. The main purpose, as was explained when we did our redevelopment area hearing, was to give the governing body as much flexibility and as much and as many options as possible in getting the boardwalk and the beachfront completely redeveloped. As you know, the boardwalk was very aggressive. I mean, the borough was very aggressive in getting the boardwalk rebuilt in time for the summer season. However, as you also know, that was basically the public walking surface, but none of the amenities that the borough had historically had along the boardwalk, including the 5th, 8th, 10th, 13th Avenue pavilions, which over time had been effectively became partnerships, basically, between the borough and private businesses that operated along the boardwalk and contributed to the atmosphere and the sense of place that the boardwalk had. All of that is gone, and those pavilions are not as easy to replace as the boardwalk was. Not that the boardwalk was easy to replace, as I'm sure you had. There was many trials that you went through in order to get that far. So what this redevelopment plan does is it focuses on the areas where the pavilions were. However, the borough has, in its interactions with the Department of Environmental Protection, has certain understandings with the DEP in terms of the ability to rebuild those pavilions. And basically, my understanding is, and what this plan is essentially based on, is that the general footprints of the pavilions that were there will be allowed to be replaced, but they don't necessarily have to be replaced in the same locations as they were in the past. So what we tried to do, and the borough has already advanced designs for the 5th and 10th Avenue pavilions as it stands. So we already have architectural designs, elevations, and so on to work with. We don't have the same for the 8th and 13th Avenue pavilions, but what you'll see in the plan was we tried to create effectively lines around the footprints of the pavilion areas that would match up with the same areas around the original pavilions. And effectively we said those areas that are, which we call redevelopment parcels. They would have, right now, is try to think of the fact that you have one big long lot 3, lot 3, that runs along the boardwalk. What we would do is create boundaries around those pavilion sites that would, at the time of the redevelopment agreement, which is the step after the redevelopment plan, if the borough were to put out an RFP, for example, and have a private redeveloper come and enter and negotiate a redevelopment agreement with the borough to reconstruct one of the pavilions, that boundary would then be set by, and that's what the language in the plan talks about, for every description of every parcel, that boundary would be set either by deed description or by survey in some way so that the borough and the developer would know what the boundaries are. What we wanted to make sure in the redevelopment plan is that for every pavilion site, that there was the same level of public access to the beach as there is today. And if you can imagine or just visualize a new pavilion that would go up that would have internal space and an area around the perimeter of the pavilion that potentially could be, so think of it, if you're familiar with a master deed for a condominium, for example, what a limited common element would be. That might be your balcony, it might be a garage. It would be owned by the association, but you would have, as a unit owner, have exclusive use of it. In this case, the potential tenants of the pavilions would have potentially use of the interior space and some percentage or some amount of the exterior space around the pavilions. And if you can imagine, it could be used for outdoor dining areas, things like that. So, and the specific boundaries of that would be established at the time of the development. So really what we're trying to do is of the entire boardwalk length, this plan really only deals with what we call the redevelopment parcels, which are the areas around where the pavilions will ultimately be built, and allows the mayor and council the option not the obligation, but the option for one or more than one of pavilions or none of the pavilions to entertain a public-private partnership to get those pavilions rebuilt. What we try to do is use and you'll notice that there was a graphic that I had initially put in the draft, which I had taken out, at the time that we started this draft redevelopment plan, we didn't have the benefit of the architectural plans that have advanced and been refined over time. There was actually a pavilion that I found an image of from New Hampshire that was very similar, very nautical, had a two-sided use where it had a beachside use and a boardwalk side use. But the problem is it was more than 2 stories. And even though we were trying to convey the concept of multiple variety uses of the buildings, we felt that it was best to take that out of the plan so that it would not create a misconception that was intended by the plan. Obviously, we know that the designs that have been developed to date are strictly 2 stories. So we don't want to suggest that this plan would allow anything more than that. And we're relying on the designs for the 5th and the 10th Avenue pavilions that have already been developed as the guide for the architectural treatment for the other pavilions that would come later. And those designs would have to be developed. They would either be developed by the borough as the 5th and 10th have been, or the borough would have the option under this redevelopment plan to put out an RFP and entertain proposals from private developers to effectively develop the pavilions for the borough. So that's really the essence of the plan. The plan would allow the mayor and council, once it's adopted, to pursue the development of all of the pavilions in whichever way was in the best interest of the borough and the residents. And that's really the essence of the plan in terms of how it's developed. There are certain statutory requirements in every redevelopment plan. The plan is designed, and you've seen the redevelopment plans, for example, for the Seaport over the years. There's really no difference in terms of the mandatory requirements for a redevelopment plan, and so this redevelopment plan is really not structured all that much differently from the Seaport redevelopment plan. So the standards that have to do with the goals and objectives of the municipality, the development standards, and so on are similar in this plan as they would be in the Seaport plan. There are a couple of things that I wanted to point out to the board. Some comments that I've already gotten back from either from folks, officials in the borough, or even some comments that your attorney had provided preliminarily, which I think were very good comments and revisions that I think I would like to just bring to your attention, so that if you agree, you can suggest that back to the borough council in terms of amendments to the plan. One thing that I believe is the case is that the plan has not actually been introduced yet. I believe, and I know the mayor's here, Mayor, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that the council referred it to the board for review, and that the council will take into account any comments that you have into a revised draft, which would then be introduced. So the mayor and council did not want it to presume that you would not have comments or not suggest changes. They wanted to send it to you first for review, and then they'll introduce it after they have the benefit of your comments. Just to give you the idea, if I can point out, if you all have copies with you, if I can just suggest a couple places where we have comments that we think would be beneficial to the plan. The first one would be on page, I believe it's page 6. No, page 5. And this is really something. Yes.
Would you mind just passing that one up?
Yeah, and this is actually the same copy that was sent to the board, so you actually got the same thing that everybody else has. On page 5, at the top, the last paragraph, this is really something to make the plan current. When we started working on this, things had not progressed as far as they are now. And I'm just going to read that last couple of sentences, or last sentence, which starts out with, since the Superstorm Sandy event for commercial uses along Ocean Avenue west of the boardwalk redevelopment area have been shut down and boarded up, while the residential uses that were not rendered uninhabitable by the storm and flooding continue to be used. And now, obviously, there's been a lot that's transpired since then, and we felt, I felt, and actually I was remiss in not checking this off before I sent it to you, but I'm going to suggest that that sentence be reworded as follows, if you can just bear with me a second. And it would read as follows: in the months immediately following Superstorm Sandy event, the commercial uses along Ocean Avenue west of the boardwalk redevelopment area had been shut down and boarded up, while the residential uses that were not rendered uninhabitable by the storm and flooding continued to be used. However, by the start of the 2013 summer season, most of the commercial and residential uses along the beachfront had been reoccupied. So what we wanted to do was really just not leave a hanging impression that those conditions still existed. Obviously, a lot of property owners had done a lot of work to try to get their properties back and up and running in time for the summer season, and we wanted to recognize that in the plan. So that would be the first proposed change I would make. The rest of them are really only clarifications, and these are some of the suggestions that I received from the board attorney. And let me just walk you through them as well. On page 10, if you can walk, that's where you look under section Roman numeral 7, which is the land use regulations. As you look under permitted uses, you can see obviously a lot of the uses that are listed as permitted are the same uses that are permitted today under the existing zoning. But we wanted to make sure, since we're dealing with both the boardwalk area and all of Ocean Avenue, that we not exclude a couple of things inadvertently. We wanted to make sure that it was clear. And so if you go down to letter E, under permitted uses on page 10, it says specialty shops, and that's a pretty broad category. We wanted to, and this is something that Mr. Kovacs had pointed out, related to promoting bicycle and pedestrian use along the board, which is something that's in the master plan and the master plan examination report. It's in the Ocean County, I'm sorry, the Monmouth County Coastal Plan. And so what we thought we'd do in order to make that clear was to say specialty shops, comma, including bicycle sales and rental shops. To make sure that it's clear and it's not, there's no question that those would be not only permitted but encouraged. And then under permitted accessory use, I'm sorry, letter F, the next one, just says municipal services and facilities. And that was meant to be all-inclusive to anything that the borough would need to operate within that area. In order to be consistent with the existing terminology in the zoning ordinance, we proposed to change that to say municipal essential services, because essential services is a defined and listed term in your zoning ordinance, and facilities, and then comma, including public parking. And that was a very good, very cogent point that Mr. Kovacs made, in that within Ocean Avenue, you have most of the parking that serves most of the beachfront, especially the boardwalk and pavilions. And we just wanted to make sure that the plan was clear that public parking was a permitted use. So that's really there as a clarification to make sure that municipal services and facilities would include public parking as a permitted use. You can kind of see the gist of this. This is really kind of fine-tuning a little bit. And then under permitted accessory uses and structures, under letter F, small letter F, where it says bike racks and bicycle storage lockers, we would suggest that read bike pathways, lanes, racks, and bicycle storage lockers. And that's really to recognize the fact that there's been recommendations in previous planning reports under the master plan that there be that Ocean Avenue and the boardwalk facilitate bicycle pathways. And we wanted to make sure that no one could say that they weren't permitted as an accessory use. And finally, we would add a letter, we would change letter G and add letter H. G would continue to read as is listed in your plan. Letter H would be inserted, and this is really just to clarify that loading areas would be permitted to serve boardwalk concessions and redevelopment parcels. And you can imagine that along Ocean Avenue and along the boardwalk, the concessions and the pavilions that are basically within the boardwalk area may need certain areas designated for loading. and we just wanted to make sure that that was clear, that that was a permitted accessory use. The locations of those would be up to the borough to determine, but we just wanted to make sure that it was clear that they were not excluded intentionally. And that is really the extent of some of the suggestions that we've come up with just in the time that we've distributed the plan to you, all as a board. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll be open to any questions the board has.
I just have a couple of quick questions for clarification, if I could. You described that it's going to be designated by way of parcels. So our primary focus in this redevelopment plan surrounds where the pavilions were.
Mhm.
So that P5 correspond
With the Fifth
That
Avenue
designation.
Pavilion, right.
with the Fifth Avenue, 8, again,
Eighth Avenue.
8th Avenue, and then, I guess, 13.
P10 and P13.
All right, so it's primarily focused around those parcels for redevelopment. If you were to, you identified that the proposed uses are primarily consistent with those things that are already in existence there. There doesn't appear to be any dramatic change in what's being proposed there, other than to make sure that you facilitate the redevelopment. Fair
That's
characterization?
correct. This is really not suggesting any change to what has historically and looking sandy been along the boardwalk. It's really another legal mechanism or legal option for the borough to use to try to restore it back to even better than what it was.
And just for purpose of my clarification, we have had basically our master plan and our re-examination plans where we have proposed traffic calming measures at the beachfront by way of different paving, bike lanes, those types of things. There's nothing in what I'm reviewing here that would preclude any of those activities, so we can continue to make things safe, pedestrian friendly, and provide for appropriate circulation there.
That's absolutely the case. There's no changes in circulation. Some redevelopments do propose changes in circulation. They might propose new roads where roads don't exist. They might propose closing roads where roads currently exist, or they might propose changing the direction of one-way streets. This plan recommends none of those
None of
changes.
those things. And all the traffic calming things that we recommend there. So it clearly meshes with the re-examination report and the master plan at this point. Is there anything in your mind which is inconsistent, either with the county plans that we are obliged to follow, or our local master plan or development regulations?
No, not at all. In fact, some of the boardwalk reconstruction that's already occurred has included some of the bump out curves and some of the improvements along the edge of the easterly side of Ocean Avenue that was recommended in many of those plans that predated Sandy.
Do we, as we have with other redevelopment plans, allow for what I characterize as temporary or intermediate uses while a permanent use is being proposed or being put in place?
Well, that would normally be under the purview of the redevelopment entity, which I should explain for the public in Belmar is really the same as the mayor and council. The statute allows municipalities to have several different types of redevelopment entities. It starts with the governing body. The governing body can delegate that authority to another body. In Belmar, the mayor and council has always been the redevelopment entity, and they would always have the determination of, in terms of any interim uses. For example, trailers might be considered an interim use. The temporary trailers that are used in place of the pavilions until the pavilions are replaced. And that certainly would be something that this plan would not preclude, and that the mayor and council would have control over. Even in terms of the use of public property, notwithstanding the redevelopment plan. Certainly with the redevelopment plan, the additional layer that the mayor and council would have is the option to solicit proposals from private entities to assist or partner with them to rebuild some of these pavilions. But certainly, it would not preclude them from any of the powers they already have as a governing body of municipal property.
You mentioned trailers. I look at that as a structure. There's nothing in this redevelopment plan which would say that structure could house a use that's not consistent.
That's right. Now, the uses would always be governed by the And they would be the same uses as are governed by the ordinance today. Effectively, the plan replaces the zoning, but it also provides for all the other powers under Section 8 of the statute that allows the flexibility of the Borough Council.
Okay, so you're not anticipating, maybe we could briefly describe that. As far as a non-permitted use where a person could come and say, look, I want to put a non-permitted use in the redevelopment plan, is that consistent with what you would do in a normal planning situation where you go put proofs on for, say, a D variance? Or aren't you permitted to do that?
Well, in this case, if this were private property, that would be the case. In this case, there's the added dimension or added consideration of the fact that all of the property that's governed by the plan is already municipally owned. So the municipality already has jurisdiction. Certainly, someone cannot entertain a use on public property without permission of the Borough Council. And effectively, that would not change whether there's a redevelopment plan or not.
I don't have any other questions. We've covered the interim uses, the sort of the overall goals that are being proposed. We've addressed the consistency of the master plan and state redevelopment matters, and the properties involved. I don't have any further questions on these things.
Board question.
You had mentioned that the footprint of the buildings had to stay the same, although they did not have to go back in the same exact location.
That's right.
What's the parameters of the boundaries? Does it have to stay in lot three, or can it extend out of that? Or?
Well, no, they would all have to stay within lot 3, so, which is a very long stretch. It's 6,000 feet long. It's just that within that stretch of boardwalk, as long as the footprints of the buildings stay consistent, we can shift those parcels around. And there's been some consideration given to the fact that since we have, the silver lining maybe is the best way to describe it, what the borough had to endure in the years since Sandy. The one silver lining is that since we're doing it over again, we have one shot, hopefully forever, to do this over again, that we can place those pavilions in the most optimal places as opposed to where they've always been. Obviously, a lot has happened along Ocean Avenue over the years in terms of a lot of positive development. And a lot of value in those properties across from the boardwalk is based on their view. So to the extent that we can retain the public use of those pavilions in a way that maximizes the value of private property across the street, that just goes to the bottom line of everybody in Belmar. And there's certainly no reason not to take advantage of every opportunity that this situation puts us in terms of rebuilding.
Thank you.
Presently, there's not a plan to rebuild 8th and 13th. Is there a time schedule where something would have to be done?
Not in a redevelopment plan. It's really, this is really just a tool on how to do it. It doesn't dictate when you have to do it. Effectively, the way the statute is now designed, used to be in the older renewal statutes that the redevelopment plans would have to have a timer, 30 years, many of them with sunset. Since 1992, when the redevelopment housing law was initially revamped and readopted, that was removed and was replaced with what's called a certificate of compliance. So effectively, the redevelopment area stays in place and the redevelopment plan stays in place until every single pavilion is redone and finished.
You mentioned 1992. There were two small buildings that were never rebuilt. Do those footprints still exist? The one at 19th Avenue and the one at 16th?
That's a good question, and I don't have the answer to that question, but I can say that, and they're not identified as redevelopment parcels in this plan. So that may have to be a situation. The only thing I can suggest, probably be the least knowledgeable in the room of those buildings.
They weren't pavilions, they were like
Buildings.
snack stands.
Yeah. What I would suggest is that if the borough council, acting as the redevelopment entity, at some point in the future determines that it's in the public interest to create parcels for them, they can amend the plan and add them to the plan at that point.
Even though it's been 20-plus years.
Right. I mean, assuming that you still have to be able to get the state permits for anything you build on the boardwalk. So, you know, that's assuming that the borough at that point had a reasonable expectation that they could get permits to rebuild them. My understanding is that what was extended by DEP were the footprints of the pavilions that existed on October 29th, 2012.
Yeah, and I can confirm that for you. When we spoke to the commissioner at DEP, our question was both on the boardwalk and the pavilions. And, as long as we stayed in the same size footprints, like you said, you can move them up and down the block, but in the same size footprints, there was no DEP or CAFRA approval required. They did say, and this was just stated, not in writing, but they did say, if you ask for something beyond that, the answer is going to be no. So in essence, practically speaking, you probably couldn't add back those buildings. You probably couldn't add anything more than what was at 8th, 10th, 5th, and 13th.
Which is, I guess, one of the reasons why, if that's the case, and that's always been the borough's understanding, that you get one shot to do it, you want to do the best job you can at replacing what you can replace.
So that's an example of, we didn't, so we've lost it.
I guess so, yeah.
So, okay, so there is that possible condition out there. If we don't do it, we lose it.
Right, now, just to be clear, the redevelopment plan doesn't have any jurisdiction over DP, and the redevelopment plan can be amended from time to time at the discretion of the borough council, borough council. So, if the borough wanted to try to attempt to get those buildings back, they could certainly amend the plan, but if they can't get capital permits for it, it's not gonna go very far anyway.
Right?
Just a clarification as to the role of the planning board going forward. We have site plan review for each individual entity that will be building, correct? So you have
Well,
a separate review for 8th Avenue, 13th
Right.
Avenue, 5th Avenue.
that's a great question, Ms. Sheridan, because typically, when a borough builds something, if it's a municipal facility, if it's in the capital budget, then it's usually part of the capital project review, which is basically a way of the planning board to see what's going on in terms of capital projects and doing a check back to the master plan. Because the master plan usually anticipates the need for those. In the case of a redevelopment situation, a public-private partnership, say one of the pavilions, the borough found it was in the interest to put out an RFP and entertain a proposal, and that proposal was selected, and there was a redevelopment agreement that created the legal boundaries within which that pavilion would be used and constructed by that developer at the developer's expense. Then my sense would be that in that situation, and this gets to be a little bit gray, but in that situation, that the borough would require that the borough conduct a full site plan on a project like that. Because by the time you see it, the borough council has probably seen 2 or 3 iterations of whatever design they were going to propose. They would have selected that developer, there would have been a lot of due diligence already in place, but this redevelopment plan still exists, and there's standards for signage in here and design standards, and you'd want to make sure that you're holding the developer accountable to the master plan and to the redevelopment plan when they come in for that review. So in that case, I think you would do a full site plan. That would be my impression.
And if I can remind you, just even in a very brief duration, the 9th Avenue Pier was one of those classic public-private partnerships after we had designated the marina as an area, in that instance was as a rehab area, which is, sort of the brother of redevelopment, if you will, or sister of redevelopment, if you will. And in that instance, you may recall that those individuals came with a complete site plan. I think and again, we don't have a final, but the way in which mayor and council handled it at that point in time was they first vetted it to this is consistent with what we want to see. It's in a quote-unquote permitted use. And then, okay, planning board, have at it. When we did our reviews as to what we thought, we took testimony from those individuals. We heard from people concerning parking concerns. And that not only was the 9th Avenue Pier side, but it was also the golf area. So I think if mayor and council intend to do it that way, it probably takes a little bit off of their plate and allows us to do what we do best.
Yeah, and just to tag on that, the redevelopment plans always, even though in the redevelopment process, you have that additional oversight by the mayor and council because it's a redevelopment situation, which is higher level of public interest than a typical site plan that a private property which is proposed. But in addition, the waiver is always under the jurisdiction of this board. So at the end of the day, the real dotting the i's, crossing the t's, and making sure all the devil's in the details review gets done is really this board, and it's up to you to be convinced if there's any waivers being requested that those waivers are justifiable. So that's a very important role that the board will always have.
I have a question. Two questions. You can move, if a piece of property, a footprint is there, you can move it any place on the beach, or you have to put it back in the same location?
Well, we can, the redevelopment plan suggests footprints, or I shouldn't say footprints, they suggest boundaries in the redevelopment plan. It effectively says the final boundaries will be determined either by deed description or survey, so they'll be precise at the time that the redevelopment agreement is done, because we have, at this point in time, we can't anticipate where that's gonna happen, where that's gonna be. But we do have an outline, for example, for the Fifth Avenue Pavilion that is different than the outline of the original Fifth Avenue Pavilion, and same thing for 10th. We have an outline for 10th that's different than the original 10th, but the boundaries around those pavilions effectively been switched. So in the plan, you'll notice that. The ultimate footprints of the 4 pavilions cannot be any different in the sum than the ones that were there in the past, but they can be in different locations.
Richard, it'd be a different location.
Right.
Second question. You have 2 buildings. Can you put one building next to another building?
The plan doesn't suggest that. The parcel boundaries or locations that are shown in this plan are generally reflective of the original locations. It's just that the 5th and 10th are switched. So other than that, the 13th is shown where the 13th was, and the 8th is shown where the 8th was. If they're moved any other place along the boardwalk, that would have to be something that the Borough Council would have to agree to first.
But it can't be
Someone
done
couldn't
in
just come in and propose it.
Anyone else? Okay, any more testimony?
That's it. Pretty basic plan.
Okay, then we're gonna open this up to public comment. If anyone would like to provide comment, please step up to the microphone and provide your name and address for the record.
As well as the spelling of your last name. Come on.
Ted Eman, 1218 Oakwood, it's E-H-M-A-N-N.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So speaking to the plan now, I know Jacob has said that basically you're going to see tonight if the plan works into the master plan. And when I was considering that, I'm very familiar with this plan and the master plan. And in fact, most redevelopment plans, I mean, I have my own copy of the Smart Growth Manual and a lot of other things that spur redevelopment now, like smart growth and sustainable development. One area of concern is that in our master plan, let's see, I better read it.
Take your time.
Yeah. In the master plan. Number 1, it says foster, reinforce strong sense of community and encourage social stability. In the master plan, it also mentions that there's extensive public outreach and public meetings. Now, in recovering from Sandy, there were a lot of problems. People were trying to get back with their life, but I reviewed the minutes of the planning meeting of March 18th. And it went pretty quickly, and there wasn't a lot of discussion about designating the boardwalk as redevelopment, and pretty much everybody voted on it. But I noticed an interesting thing that our planner, Mr. Roberts, said. It said the next step is to, hang on, this is in the minutes. Mr. Roberts explained to the board, the process is to have the board hold public meetings and to make recommendations to the mayor and council. Do you remember saying that?
That would be on the redevelopment plan.
Right.
Which is what tonight's about.
Correct, but this is before the plan. This is the next step after, all right, yeah, it's after the study, so that's right. So now we're at the point now where I really do want to encourage, the body, the board, to really take that on. Because, in hindsight, it's unusual for a plan to happen after, 6 months later. And there has been sizable feedback even before Mr. Roberts released the plan, and we saw it for the first time on the 18th. So in a sense, in hindsight, we're looking at basically 2 voter referendums and 3 lawsuits as of Friday. So in hindsight, I don't really know if the consensus building and the public hearings on a high-profile area like the boardwalk has really been accomplished. My personal feeling is that this whole thing, starting with redevelopment and then the boardwalk, is trying to put a square peg in a round hole. And everything I've read in redevelopment, smart growth, people, they avoid areas like natural wonders like the seashore. They avoid all that because the whole basis, and again, that brings up another point in the redevelopment, which has really to do with quality of life improvements. And if you look at all the manuals on sustainable living, redevelopment, sustainable redevelopment, smart growth, it stresses neighborhoods. So the stress really, and it started with the master plan. When the master plan was done in Belmar, it was an effort to look at this place for basically full-time residents, to get away from tourism as much as it was to develop this kind of social, sustainable society. No, less cars, lots of public transportation, lots of jobs for people that live here, great schools, the whole 9 yards. But all redevelopment plans focus on basically, the successful ones focus on neighborhoods and social organizing and improving the quality of life. And now we're taking something that's the round hole, and the square peg is trying to take a need to get buildings on the boardwalk and stick it into that. And it's not a good fit. That's just my feeling. Thank you.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Mike?
Mike, see that 110 Avenue, SVEDEC. I heard a lot of testimony about we did this and we did that in terms of the planning of this, and heard a lot, attended meetings by the mayor and council about these pavilions. And up until recently, I was under the impression I was being cut back to 2, and now this redevelopment plan clearly calls for 4. And not only does it do that, but it puts some of the most important decisions back into just the hands of the mayor and council to negotiate with whomever they want, and whatever the outcome is, we pretty much have to be satisfied. And the non-council members of this planning board are going to become accomplices in that. And the one thing I'm kind of disappointed in my neighbors up on this committee is that no one's talked about the fact there's been so much outcry about input into the buildings. I was told this evening, I listened to Mr. Roberts, testified in fact that essentially everything's going to be the same. If it's all going to be the same, why do all these buildings have to be 2-story? Why do we have to take on all this expense? I was at a council meeting where a gentleman, Chris Lamalt, stood up and said, why aren't we seeing any kind of pro formas to let us know what these buildings are ultimately going to cost the taxpayers? Where are the hard decisions as to really where the money's going to come from, how these are going to be paid for? This town is going through a tremendous change and a lot of repair and rebuild. In the process, it's also taking on a staggering amount of debt. And that's part of the reason why so many people are coming before these committees and councils and asking questions and want to know, why are we moving so quickly and not looking at all the decisions and providing people with all of the information? Again, if nothing's essentially going to change, why does everything have to be 2 stories? The voter referendum that was signed by 519 of your neighbors, voters in the town of Belmar, all it did was stipulate on a ballot that they have the opportunity to weigh in by vote on whether the buildings were 2-story or 1-story. Pretty simple request. So again, I reiterate, if nothing's essentially changing, why all of this development? The other thing I'm concerned about is the fact that, again, echoing the smart development, the community input, I really think that you all have an obligation to the neighbors and people in this town who pay taxes to be responsible in providing as much information as possible. And I come to all the council meetings saying, no, we need more information, we need more information. I just downloaded the bid specs of the building, they're already out, a bond ordinance is already passed. That didn't include the redevelopment plan, I might add, so another bond ordinance is gonna be, don't you guys even feel like you're being bypassed, or maybe being brought in as an afterthought, non-council members? I'm deeply concerned about the way this is moving forward. I think you owe it to all of the people in Belmar to weigh these decisions very heavily. These are huge expenditures, this is a huge undertaking, and as somebody said this evening, this is gonna be for a long time. So I would like to ask that everybody weigh all of that in consideration when they recommend or not recommend, or whatever the next process is for the planning board here with this development plan. Thank you. Can I just suggest one thing on that? I know-
Oh, I'm sorry, please.
No, I just, again, I certainly don't want to have the planning board discount anything that anyone says here this evening. But I would be remiss as your counsel if I didn't identify what your role is under the statute. And these are certainly concerns he's speaking to his neighbors. It's his meeting too. But in terms of